Hi, my name's Vance Locke, and I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies here in the School of Psychology at UWA. Psychology at UWA can be studied through either the Social and Applied Psychology major or the Neuropsychology and Cognitive Science major. Of course, to become a psychologist and to be registered as a psychologist in Australia, you need to complete both of those majors. But for the rest of this video, I'll be talking about the Social and Applied Psychology major. The first year of that major, there's 2 units you have to complete. So the first of the units that you'll undertake in first year is called Mind and Behaviour. Now that unit deals with many of the facets of the human mind that you wouldn't often think of as something that psychologists would be interested in. So for example, how the brain works. Now on face value, you'd think that's really an important thing for psychologists to be interested in. But usually we think of these things as maybe related to neurosciences or anatomy. And that's true to some extent. What psychologists are interested in is what those parts of the brain do. How do they relate to memory? How do they relate to language? How do they relate to everyday life and your ability to do things? Also in that course you'll learn about things like how we memorize things and the kinds of errors you get with memory. So for example, during eyewitness testimony. So if you're called up by the police or through courts and you need to give testimony about something, what do you need to know about how memory works to ensure the best recollections are available? Now the other unit done in first year is called Behaviour and Context. Now that unit deals much more with the person as a whole. It's not interested so much in what happens in the brain, but how the person as a whole integrates into society and how they change over their lifespan. So in that unit we'll be looking at things like how we change from when we're infants through to when we're older. We'll also be looking at things like social psychology, which is how groups interact, how prejudice occurs, how we judge people. We're also going to look at things like personality, what makes us different, what makes me an extrovert and you an introvert. And lastly, we're also going to look at what happens when these things begin to go wrong, so abnormal or clinical psychology. Related to that, the last applied area we'll look at in that unit is industrial and organisational psychology. So how psychology works in the workplace, how it allows us to interact with other people, to get the most out of ourselves and others. Now in your second and third year of this major, we have some compulsory units and we have some optional units. Now the compulsory units focus a fair bit on research methods. In other words, how we understand things about people in psychology, how we investigate them, how we discover them, and how we can use that information. Now that starts in second year, where the first methods or research methods unit is called psychological research methods, unsurprisingly. Now that unit focuses a lot on how we might measure everyday human occurrences. So expression of attitudes, personality, and even through to things like differences between groups, which might be interesting to you if you wanted to compare psychological treatments, for example. Or you might want to compare how a team does under one coach versus another. When you get to third year, we continue with that theme with 2 units that focus on the kinds of research methods that psychologists use. The first of them is called Psychological Measurement and its Applications. Now that unit takes many of the things you would have learnt in second year and begins to look at how they influence us in everyday life and how we can use them to better society. So for example, how can we use things that we know about people, such as IQ, personality, and actually use those to predict how they'll do in the future or what kind of jobs might suit them better. The other compulsory psychological methods or research methods units has a long title. It's called Psychological Science in the Modern World, Challenges and Controversies. Now that's about the application of psychology to the kind of controversial big social issues of our day. So for example, at the moment, the unit focuses a lot on things like climate change. Is it real? Is it really the issue for us? As psychologists, we want to know, assume it is real. How can we help make people or improve people's compliance with things like recycling? How can we get people to reduce their energy use? It's one thing to just tell them to stop, but as psychologists, can we improve things so that they are more likely to turn their lights off and more likely to recycle? Also, that unit looks at things like prejudice, discrimination, how best to school our children. Now, alongside those compulsory units, there are 4 optional units which you can choose from in second or third year. Those units cover a range of psychological topics. The first one I'll talk about is lifespan development. Lifespan development is really interested in how we change from when we're infants through to when we're, well, really old, even older than me. And how your psychology changes. So when you're a child or an infant, what are you able to perceive and think about? What are the limits on that? And then when you're an adult, what capabilities do you have? And as you get older, what do you lose? And what do you gain? The second unit's called Psychology and Social Behaviour. And that unit looks at human beings in their social context. So for example, how are you when you talk on the internet, and how do you differ talking on the internet to when you're in a group with other people your own age? And how might you then change talking to your parents, or your parents' parents, your grandparents, or you're in a group of people at work? How we change from situation to situation is one of the core questions of social psychology. Social psychology is also interested in why we help each other, and why we don't, aggression, obedience, and prejudice, just to name a few. Now the other 2 units that are there as optional units in second and third year, both are applied psychology units. So these focus on the application of basic psychology to different applied settings. The first of those is industrial and organisational psychology. And this is the study of psychology in the workplace. Now it's as broad as everything from how you select people to work, how you get the best out of them when they start working, but also how you design workplaces. So is a heads-up display on one of the new fighter aircraft optimal for making decisions about who to shoot down and who not to? And the other unit is called adult psychopathology. And adult psychopathology deals with, I guess, the things you would commonly see on the news and on television shows. Things such as anxiety, depression, psychosis, kinds of things that impact on many of us throughout our lives. If you studied both psychology majors, you can go on to complete an honours degree or a 4th year in psychology. Completing a 4th year is a necessary step if you want to become a psychologist, because you need at least 4 years study in psychology to become registered as a psychologist with the Psychology Board of Australia. But for the moment, let me just focus on what that 4th year, that honours degree, actually looks like. A little over half that degree will actually involve doing an individual research project. You'll be paired up with a supervisor in the school, and you'll conduct research independently on your own for a whole year. Now that may involve interacting with a group. So for example, some of our students interact with off-campus groups. For example, some will look at things like Parkinson's, some will look at school children, how they develop, how they learn, or maybe even the emotional difficulties they have. Some will work closely on the university campus, working with issues to do with prejudice, reading, perception, intelligence, a whole range of issues relevant to everyday people and everyday life. The other part of the honours year involves 3 units. Those units, much like your second and third and first year units, ask you to do a particular topic in depth. But at 4th year level, you can imagine we're asking you to do a lot more in depth than you have so far. One of those units looks at the big questions in psychology. So for example, what's happiness? What's consciousness? Another one of those units looks at specific research methods that might help you with your research project and allow you, when you become a psychologist, to understand the kinds of research people are producing in your field. And the 3rd unit is really looking at specific topics related to the application of psychology. So for example, how do you use the things you've learned in second and third and first year in everyday situations that psychologists might work in, from organisations to working with individual clients or working with people with head trauma or children, a whole range of different areas. After honours, many students will go on to postgraduate degrees. Now there are 2 types I'm going to talk to you about. The first is what we call professional postgraduate degrees, and these really are to qualify you to work in specific fields of psychology. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the research-oriented degrees. Let me start with the professional ones. There's 2 main professional areas we teach to here in the School of Psychology. The first is one you're probably familiar with, and that's clinical psychology. Now, clinical psychology requires you to do at least a minimum of 2 years of extra training after your honours degree. So that takes you through to at least 6 years. Here at UWA we offer a couple of different ways of doing that. One is the Doctor of Psychology, and that's going to take you a minimum of 3 years, and that involves some advanced clinical psychology training along with some advanced research training. And then there's what we call a Master's PhD double degree, and that offers you again advanced clinical training but with a full-blown PhD. Now both of those allow you to call yourself a doctor at the end. Most importantly, they allow you to register as clinical psychologists, which is a specialist topic that the Psychology Board of Australia confers to only people who have completed that level of training at universities. At the end of honours, many students will want to go on and become professional psychologists, and we offer 2 degrees teaching into the professional areas of psychology. One's industrial organisational, working in businesses, human resources, human relations, and also clinical psychology, which you're probably more familiar with, which looks at things like affective disorders, ageing, trauma, all the kinds of things you usually see on television psychologists doing. And also we offer a research degree or a PhD for those students interested in becoming researchers and contributing to the body of knowledge that psychology produces about how we work and how best to treat people. After those postgraduate qualifications, our students go on to many different careers. It all depends on what they trained in. So for example, those who've done clinical degrees or clinical postgraduate degrees go on to work in the government, the health department. They might work with the elderly, with kids, they might work with drugs and rehab. There's a whole range of different careers open to them. These days increasingly we're seeing them work in private practice as well. If you go through the industrial organisational stream, you might find yourself working for a business, you might find yourself working in human relations, selections, really personality testing. So many organisations use psychologists now in lots of different situations, from how to select people to how to get the best performance out of them. And finally, of course, there's our PhD program where we have graduates not only working in universities, some of the top research institutions around the world, but also working for things like government agencies like DSTO, Defence Science Technology Office, through to private employers who want psychologists with both the research skills and the knowledge to help them do everything from marketing to designing the best kind of lenses for glasses. So no matter what path you take, hopefully you'll find psychology to be enjoyable and interesting as you progress through the years. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you in class sometime.